Welcome on this wonderful New York winter day that finds us in the second half of the IRP's 50th anniversary. And IRP has grown and thrived in the new school environment. IRP now serves as the model for more than 400 other campus-based learning in retirement programs. The two people who have shepherded this series of programs deserve our appreciation and our thanks. They are IRP students Jane Osmers and Eva Vogel. In my 30 years at the university, we have frequently joked about the This was a symbol of the need to integrate the broad offerings of the new school into a coherent mass. Today's guest has helped to make this happen. He is James Miller, Chair of the Liberal Studies and Program and Professor of Political Science at the new school. He received his PhD in the History of Ideas from Brandeis University. His books include Examined Lives from Socrates to Nietzsche, and that book joins books on a variety of topics, ranging from Flowers in the Dustbin, The Rise of Rock and Roll, 1947 to 1977, which was the winner of the ASCAP Deems Taylor Award for the Best Musical Book in 1999. He has written about Michael Foucault and was the original editor of the Rolling Stone Illustrated History of Rock and Roll. He has written about music since the 1960s, which is when one of his early reviews appeared in the third issue of Rolling Stone. Subsequent pieces have appeared in the New Republic, the New York Times, and Newsweek, where he was a book reviewer and pop music critic between 1981 and 1990. We are proud to have with us today Professor Jim Miller.
So thank you for coming out on a snowy, wintry day. I mean, after 48 hours of saying we were going to get a big storm, it was kind of funny to wake up and say, oh, it's actually snowing. Ever since Hurricane Sandy, you know, it's become, I don't remember New York being quite this panicky about weather until, you know, Mother Nature put the hammer down. What I'm going to do today is give a very short, I'm going to read a paper that will take about half an hour, and that should give plenty of time to get into a question and answer, because it's a topic that I'm going to be, what I'm talking about today, I think is better served in many ways by having a conversation rather than by having somebody like me talk at you. The paper is based on my book, Examined Lives, that was published now a couple of years ago. And this is a paper that I've devised to try to open up at least some of the themes and issues and questions that were raised for me while I was working on this particular book. So the title of my paper is The Examined Life Worth Living? It's one of the most famous lines in the history of Western civilization. The unexamined life is not worth living. Thus spoke Socrates, at least according to Plato. But what does this famous assertion really mean in practice, and is it really true? I certainly grew up believing that it was true, and my interest in the proposition was a key motive behind the writing of my book, Examined Lives from Socrates to Nietzsche. This book consists of 12 biographical essays recounting the lives of 12 philosophers who tried, each in his own way, to live his life philosophically. The 12 I write about are Socrates, Plato, Diogenes the Cynic, Aristotle, Seneca, Augustine, Montaigne, Descartes, Rousseau, Kant, Emerson, the lone American, and Nietzsche. And it's a recurrent quandary in my book, the potential fruits of self-examination, that I want to address today. For Socrates, as for many philosophers who've tried to measure up to his avowed ambition, in Plato's words, quote, to live the life of a philosopher, to examine myself and others, this ambition has in some way revolved around an effort to answer to the Delphic injunction, know thyself. Yet what this injunction means is hardly self-evident. After all, what is the self that these seekers have sought to know? Is it an immaterial form? Is it perhaps even God within, as Augustine will suggest? Or is it rather a motley coat of many colors stitched out of contradictory characteristics? For that matter, is self-knowledge even feasible, and if so, to what degree? Quote, I am still unable, confides Socrates in Plato's Phaedrus, I am still unable to know myself. Despite years of painful self-examination, Nietzsche, 2,000 years later, famously declared that, quote, we are necessarily strangers to ourselves. We have to misunderstand ourselves. If we seek, shall we find? And if we can't perhaps ever find what we're looking for, of what value really is an examined life? With these questions in mind, and in an effort to spark a dialogue with you after I'm done speaking, I want to talk very briefly this afternoon about two specific exemplars of the examined life, Socrates and Montaigne. I'll begin as the tradition described in my book properly begins, with Socrates. It will be good to recall the circumstances surrounding the last dramatic act in the life of Socrates, his trial in Athens in 399 BC, where he had to rebut charges that he was impious and corrupting the young. Two accounts of the subsequent trial survive, one by Xenophon, the other by Plato. Though professional orators often prepared texts for clients to deliver at such trials, Plato and Xenophon agreed that Socrates improvised his own speech on the spot. They also agreed that he was defiant and sometimes spoke in an arrogant tone. The charge of impiety and such accusations were routinely brought against one's political enemies in the Athens of the day. Socrates rebutted by reference to the oracle at Delphi. At some point after Socrates had embarked on an eccentric career of contemplative introspection, a friend had journeyed to the temple of Apollo at Delphi, where cities as well as individuals in this period frequently went to receive divine guidance. At Delphi, according to Plato, this friend consulted, as one normally did, the Pythia, the priestess through whom the god Apollo spoke. There were two ways to consult the Delphic oracle. A written response required the sacrifice of an animal, but a simple yes or no cost nothing. Whether the answer was yes or no was determined by lot. It depended on whether the Pythia randomly plucked from an urn a bean that was white or a bean that was black. Since the friend was probably too poor to offer an animal for sacrifice, it's likely that he popped a simple question and that the Pythia plucked a bean to produce a response. Was anybody wiser than Socrates? No. According to Plato, in his Apology, Socrates reacted to this news as any pious Greek would. The god Apollo never lied. But Socrates did not regard himself as wise, so what could the oracle mean? From this point forward, the life of Socrates became a consecrated quest, an epic inquiry meant to unriddle a message from a god. His search for wisdom became an obsession. According to Plato, he ceased, quote, to engage in public affairs to any extent. A noteworthy decision, given the prevailing belief, most memorably expressed by Pericles, that abstention from public affairs rendered an Athenian citizen useless. At his trial, Socrates nevertheless explained how his unusual way of life grew out of his earnest effort to take the message of Apollo seriously. What does the god mean? This is Plato's version of his speech. What is his riddle? I am very conscious that I'm not wise at all. What then does he mean by saying that I am the wisest? For surely he does not lie. It is not legitimate for him to do so. As Socrates sees it, his quest to answer the riddle proves his pious regard for the commands of Apollo. But perhaps the most challenging charge to rebut was that Socrates had corrupted the youth of Athens. Many of the jurors were liable to recall Alcibiades, the most famous of Socrates' former students, who, besides being a brilliantly effective general, became a notoriously treacherous politician who at various times in his life offered his talents to Sparta and to Persia as well as to his native Athens. Instead of answering the charge of corrupting the young directly, Socrates dropped his mild manner and turned on his principal accuser, the poet Meletus. Xenophon reports a series of taunts. Quote, do you know anyone who is less a slave to bodily desires than I am? Do you know anyone who is more free? Could you plausibly regard anyone as more upright? The taunts amounted to a counter-indictment. By obeying the command of the god at Delphi and living a life utterly different from the conventional forms of life followed by Meletus or any of the assembled jurors, or implicitly any of his disgraced former students, including Alcibiades, it is he, Socrates, who has become a paragon of perfect virtue. Those who have charged him with injustice are themselves unjust. It is they who should stand trial. Under the Athenian democracy, the jury at a trial consisted of a large panel of citizens. In the case of Socrates, there were probably 501 in all. Odd numbers were used to avoid a tie in voting. The accusers and the accused spoke in turn. When the speeches were over, jurors delivered a verdict by voting with stones. By a slim margin, the jury found Socrates guilty. Even though his jury of peers had found his defense unpersuasive, Socrates' account of himself, as Plato presents it, to this day remains the classical image of the philosopher. A seeker in endless quest of knowledge, Socrates is humbled by the recognition that he lacks wisdom about the greatest things, how to live well, how to be happy, what death holds in store. Yet because he knows that he does not know, he paradoxically is wiser than his Athenian peers, and perhaps even, just as Apollo had proclaimed, the wisest Athenian of them all. And even though he has no systematic doctrines to communicate, no dogmas to teach, he has lived an apparently good life, conducted by relentlessly examining himself and others. Skeptical of the convictions commonly held by his fellow citizens, he will behave fearlessly, running the risk of seeming arrogant. And skeptical though he may be about his own understanding of the greatest things, he will consistently refuse to do anything that he has found reason to regard as unjust or wrong. As Plato implies, his enemies suspected Socrates of speaking with irony in its original, primarily pejorative sense of deliberate deceit. But the Socrates of Plato's Apology is emphatically no ironist. Quote, throughout my life in any public activity I may have engaged in, I am the same man as I am in private life. Unlike his student Alcibiades, Socrates has never flattered, the demos, the people of Athens. He has never shifted his loyalties under false pretenses. He will neither don masks nor lie about his true beliefs. Quote, "From me you will hear the whole truth, though not by Zeus gentlemen expressed in embroidered and stylized phrases. If he has, quote, neglected what occupies most people, wealth, household affairs, the position of general or public orator or other offices, that is because, quote, I thought myself too honest to survive. Socrates consistently says only what he thinks to be true and does only what he believes to be right, demonstrating his convictions, quote, not in words, but in action." Here, as in other texts by other Socratic writers, we are encouraged to appraise the character of Socrates by judging his integrity. And this requires judging how his life fits or fails to fit with his declared convictions. Like its classical cognate, the English word integrity has a range of connotations, from wholeness and completeness to soundness and freedom from defect. In certain contexts, the word has a physical bearing, as when an engineer speaks of a sound physical structure as having integrity. In still other contexts, the word in English more simply evokes moral goodness. The Socrates of Plato's Apology has integrity in all of these senses. He is physically sound and morally unblemished, and he is consistently able to harmonize his actions with the beliefs he provisionally holds after rationally examining them. On trial, he represents himself as a paragon of rational unity, a daunting model of moral perfection. To achieve such a rational unity implicitly requires that one hold a set of beliefs about the best way to live that are consistent and reasonable, and also that one's conduct comport with these beliefs. This will be an especially tough challenge for anyone committed, as Socrates is in the Apology, to a way of life that enjoins a continuing examination of one's core beliefs. Because if you change your mind, you have to change your conduct. At the same time, and despite his avowed ignorance about answers to the ultimate questions about the meaning of life, the immortality of the soul, the existence of God, the Socrates of Plato's Apology personifies the most sublime sort of conviction. However inconclusive his efforts to become wise, the beliefs that he does hold, however provisionally, are beliefs that he is prepared to die for. Serene in his willingness to sacrifice himself, he will give up living in order to prove his unswerving commitment to his unending search for wisdom. Idealized though it may be, can we live in accordance with this character? Or is the image of the first philosopher in Plato's Apology literally too good to be true? Writing almost 2,000 years after Plato wrote the Apology, Montaigne, in his essays, concluded that Plato's account of Socrates' perfect moral goodness, achieved through a rational unity of belief and conduct, was not only impossible to emulate, it was also, in some circumstances, an ideal with vicious consequences. In theory, if one takes seriously the views expressed in the pages of the essays, the one book Montaigne published in his lifetime, which ran from 1533 to 1592, Montaigne was a pluralist. That is, a man keenly aware of the variety, transience, and sheer contingency of all moral and political customs and laws and conventions. Yet in practice, fearful as he was of bloody anarchy, which was a constant possibility in his lifetime, the pluralist was also an absolutist, a titled aristocrat who was also a magistrate and briefly the mayor of Bordeaux, who was ready on prudential grounds to submit to the dictates of the Catholic king of his homeland, France. Eschewing blunt honesty of the sort exemplified by Socrates in Plato's Apology, Montaigne forged an oblique new style of writing suited to the world of witch hunts and religious persecution that he inhabited. Quote, "We owe ourselves in part to society, but in the best part to ourselves," he remarks. And that part Montaigne explored by writing 107 essays and committing the best part of himself to paper. Quote, "What rule my life belonged to, I did not learn until after it was completed and spent," he writes, and then exclaims almost exultantly, "A new figure, an unpremeditated and accidental philosopher." Montaigne's dilemma, qua philosophy, as it had been understood by most of the classical schools in the ancient world, was simple. In search of a stable core, of a coherent self with a resolute will, consistently capable of executing the commands of reason, Montaigne's search had revealed instead what Augustine once called the abyss of human consciousness. But unlike Augustine or the Renaissance humanists who followed in his footsteps, Montaigne conspicuously lacked a compensatory faith in an indwelling God. At no point does he entertain the hope that a man suffused with pure intellect might transform himself into an angel and the Son of God. Quite the contrary. The longer Montaigne pondered the facts of history, the sheer variety of social customs, and the many odd things he had personally seen and experienced, the more Montaigne felt forced to acknowledge that every man was inevitably a changeling, a bundle of inescapable pains and pleasures, with an intellect that was incurably impure and a mind that more often than not was uninformed by logic, unregulated by clear ideas, and filled instead with countless, this is Montaigne's words, flutterings. In response, Montaigne chose to try to compose himself, to try to pull himself together by writing down his wandering thoughts, rather than struggling to improve himself through dialectical reasoning, Stoic austerities, or Christian asceticism. Quote, "I have not, like Socrates, corrected my natural disposition by force of reason. I let myself go as I have come." As the years passed and his experience of the world widened, Montaigne restlessly kept revising and rewriting his essays, piling words upon words, building up an emblematic collage, stitching new sentences into existing essays, letting non sequiturs proliferate, amassing ever more historical and political vignettes, more contradictory quotes from quarreling sages, both ancient and modern, and more of his own miscellaneous and generally inconclusive thought experiments concerning matters large and small, both abstract and concrete. Defiantly unsystematic, the style of the whole is as novel as the philosophy it expresses, revealing a new inner world as confounding as anything the conquistadors had unearthed beyond the sea. Quote, "If we could view that expanse of countries and ages, boundless in every direction, into which the mind, plunging and spreading itself, travels so far and wide that it can find no limit where it can stop, there would appear in that immensity an infinite capacity to produce innumerable forms." The protean potential of human beings is not simply, as secular humanists sometimes avow, clinching evidence of the dignity of man. It is also evidence of the infinite folly of human beings, a source of amusement that may also provoke horror. The mind of man is capable of anything. At the time that Montaigne was writing these essays, between 1572 and 1592, France was convulsed by a calamitous civil war waged for ostensibly religious reasons and fought between equally ruthless rival armies of Huguenots and Catholics. Montaigne, who had become well known among his influential peers for his political discretion and independent spirit, was drawn into the fray as a negotiator, at first between the Protestant Henry of Navarre and the Catholic Henry of Guise, and later between Henry of Navarre and the Catholic King Henry III. Perhaps because of his direct experience as a trusted intermediary between sworn enemies, Montaigne gave voice in his book to a ruthlessly unsentimental sort of realpolitik, one that justified the wiles and willingness to bend principles characteristic of enlightened diplomats in search of peaceful ways to resolve violent disputes. As Montaigne well knew, such politically cunning behavior implicitly contradicted the classical model of philosophical virtue. I quote again from Socrates in the Apology of Plato: "Throughout my life, in any public activity I may have engaged in, I am the same man as I am in private life." Yet Montaigne pointedly and repeatedly avowed just the opposite. Quote, "We are all patchwork, and so shapeless and diverse in composition that each bit, each moment plays its own game." Unlike Socrates, Montaigne holds the changeability of human beliefs and behavior to be sometimes a virtue and not inevitably a vice. He thought it possible, quote, "to love virtue too much. Self-righteousness could breed a murderous fanaticism." And Montaigne himself was flexible enough to parley with Catholics and parley with Protestants, too. Anyone wishing to judge the author of the essays by traditional norms of integrity will find him wanting, as the most fervent Catholics and Protestants in his own lifetime often did. He rejected in practice, and also in the pages of his essays, the kind of unyielding conviction and resolute consistency epitomized by Socrates. My descriptions of Socrates and Montaigne, which I've extracted from my book, are of course cursory, too brief to do justice to all the nuances and complexities that their examples actually present. But even a brief comparison of Montaigne with Socrates leaves us with at least one obvious conundrum. On the one hand, the image of Socrates in Plato's Apology offers a strenuous ideal of perfect integrity. On the other hand, the image of Montaigne in his essays offers a contrasting model of a natural character, that is, an individual prey to typical impulses and desires and committed to a variety of typical personal convictions, but also holding sometimes contradictory and equally typical beliefs as well, all of which stand in tension and sometimes frankly contradict what this person says and does in public. As he appears in the pages of his book, Montaigne, moreover, is often frankly foolish and irrational. Yet his follies also take a shape that is unmistakably his own, a unique style of life uncovered in the essays through a kind of free association long before Freud had invented psychoanalysis. Confronted with the singular self that emerges in the pages of the essays, one could exclaim, as Nietzsche once did, that Montaigne ultimately gives us a portrait of, quote, "the freest and most vigorous of spirits." But one would also have to concede, as Emerson, another admirer of Montaigne, famously did, that, quote, "a foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of small minds." And that, of course, is not a conclusion that either a true Socratic or a consistently rational philosopher will be happy to admit. I return to the questions with which I started. Is the examined life worth living? Is self-knowledge even feasible? If we seek, shall we find? As someone raised in the Midwest in the 1950s within a Lutheran community that prized introspection and sincere professions of good faith, and then was initiated into the study of academic philosophy through existentialism, I had long assumed that, of course, the examined life is not worth living. But as an historian who has finished telling the stories of 12 different men who labored to live up to the Socratic ambition in very different times and places, I'll confess that some of my old assumptions about the value of an examined life have been shaken, in part because recounting these particular philosophical lives has provoked a variety of unexpected reactions, not just awe and admiration, but also pity, chagrin, and in a few instances, amused disbelief. In antiquity, living an examined life of integrity was not generally thought to be an end in itself. For some of the ancient philosophers, it was a means to attain happiness and tranquility. For others, a preparation for wisely wielding political power. And for still others, a necessary precondition for eternal salvation. Most of the ancient authors envisioned it as a quest that harmonized well with both rigorous inquiry and an overriding faith in God or the good. Yet for Montaigne, and for many of those moderns who've struggled most ruthlessly to describe honestly the motley character of one's inner experience, the quest for self-knowledge no longer fits easily with either a confidence in science or belief in a divinely ordered cosmos. Even worse, the very practice of self-examination, given the protean and transient character of inner experience, seems in modern times to have become a recurrent and potentially chronic source of depression. Montaigne speaks of his melancholy humor, and in the cases of Rousseau and Nietzsche, perhaps even a source of madness. Some may welcome such a chastening result, for the intransigently conflicted self plumbed by modern philosophers from Montaigne to Nietzsche stands revealed as wretched, vain, and all too human because it is all too guilty of falling short in an effort to lead a life of perfect integrity. Such perfection is divine, not human. In some moods, Montaigne, as a good student of Augustine, shared this humbling view, but Montaigne explicitly rejected those forms of moral perfectionism that entailed a chronic feeling of guilt, and he was fortunate, like Emerson, to have found for himself, in part through his introspective essays, an equable temperament, which enabled him to behold the failings and follies of himself and others with an enviable equanimity. Nietzsche, by contrast, had no such luck. Tormented by his tortuous quest to become what one is, he was unable to lift the burden of guilt he scrutinized and relentlessly criticized in his writing, perhaps because his character proved to be indelibly marked by the practices of punishing self-examination he had learned from his Lutheran father, a minister, and learned again from those ancient philosophers who were as obsessed as he became with fearlessly answering what Michel Foucault once called, quote, the question of truth, the truth concerning what one is, what one does, and what one is capable of doing. The moral of the philosophical lives I've studied is therefore neither simple nor uniformly edifying. For anybody hoping for happiness or political wisdom or salvation, philosophical self-examination seems in practice to have led to self-doubt as often as self-trust, to misery as often as joy, to reckless public acts as often as prudent political conduct, and to moments of self-inflicted torment as often as moments of saving grace. No wonder Montaigne spoke of the philosopher in search of wisdom as, quote, the investigator without knowledge, the magistrate without jurisdiction, and all in all the fool of the farce. And yet, even today, most of us admire integrity where we find it, and we judge harshly public moralists who turn out to be hypocrites, preaching virtues they violate in practice. And I, for one, feel I have no choice. Like it or not, I feel duty-bound to try to follow in the footsteps of Socrates and Augustine and to try to live an examined life, even if taking these ideals seriously in the wake of Montaigne, Emerson, and Nietzsche seems now to entail an unending quest with no firm goal and no certain reward. Apart from experiencing, however briefly, a yearning for wisdom and a desire to live a life in harmony with that yearning, come what may.
Thank you so much. I had a question for you regarding what, I don't know if you'd be able to speak to this, but what do you think is the role of psychotherapy today in the process of self-examination? Because it's the first thing that came to my mind, and how it's evolved from more psychoanalytic to a trend towards shorter-term cognitive behavioral therapy, quick fixes.
Uh-huh. How many psychotherapists are in the room before I even open my mouth on this subject? This is potentially quite dangerous, you know. Obviously, I mean, in my lifetime, when I first got to Boston, the default position for psychiatry was everybody was supposed to be psychoanalyzed, and psychoanalysis ruled the roost. And at some point I realized that the only reason psychoanalysis was still in business is that they had a captive audience of future psychiatrists who had to pay large amounts of money to get an analysis. Meanwhile, research into new pharmaceuticals was coming online, and there were very different approaches taken. And in any case, the whole process was being driven by the insurance industry and what they would pay for. So unless you're independently wealthy and have a lot of time on your hands, you know, I think obviously in New York City, psychoanalysis is alive and well in 42 different warring sectarian versions on offer. I'm sure just blocks from where we are right today. But I think for the rest of the United States, it's like that approach is seen as self-indulgent and you know, not acceptable. I mean, it's odd because the United States, I think, at the same time, it has this very conflicted relationship towards psychiatry and mental illness. Has a robust preoccupation with self-help literature and self-help books. So if you go to a Barnes & Noble, you'll find, you know, basically 30 volumes of quack Emersonianism on offer, and often quack psychology. So that would be my answer.
In my superficial examination of philosophy, I have come across what we call questions and what we call answers. And I find what's more valuable than answers are questions. So that, therefore, I think I have at times greater doubt about my life than I have certainty. But I think that's actually better, not to just accept what may become an ideology of a philosopher, but to examine, oh, this is an idea, and then what does it have to do with my life? So I'm not so depressed by anybody who says, I have found the answer, this is a way to live. I'd rather have, maybe, should we look at this? Should we question this? That to me is good enough.
That's a good comment. I mean, in antiquity, there was a whole school of philosophy, which Montaigne was well aware of, associated with the philosopher Pyrrho, who thought that there were no good answers to any of the important questions, but if one studied all the obviously false answers provided to the important questions, one would come to be apathetic about the lack of answers to these important questions, and therefore would achieve serenity and happiness.
Yeah, as a psychoanalytically trained psychotherapist, it's unfortunate that so much of the so-called psychoanalytic field has been, I think, distorted and corrupted by the pharmaceutical industry and, you know, by other means in this society for, you know, I think shortchanging and, really not really describing. And I will say, having had myself a 7-year analysis on the couch, the most important precept of this process, certainly as I experienced it from a psychiatrist and an analyst, is that yes, you have to learn about yourself. And as actually a patient of mine once said, everything that you learn about yourself is not delicious. And the importance of this struggle, which goes on throughout your life, that what you learn in analysis can help you with that struggle and the conflicts, and so.
Jim? Oh, okay. I guess I have the microphone over here.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
I agree with that comment. I don't have.
You agree with
more
that?
to-
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. The unexamined life is worth or not worth living. It's yourself that you're examining. In the past 30 years with brain research, we've seen that the self is even more complicated than Freud thought it was in terms of the unconscious. Do you think we're moving in the direction of ourselves being less or more knowable, given what we know about the way that our brain interacts and how much of 90% of our self-behavior is determined by our unconscious in ways that we're not really understanding?
I didn't know they had assigned an exact percentage.
99.
It's going up even as we speak. We live in a very interesting time. I mean, my book is very old school. I really shouldn't be here talking at the New School. It's so old school. And it is clearly the notions of the self that are put into play by all of my philosophers would be looked askance at by somebody like Steve Pinker, who I had on an editorial board once, and I know how he thinks, and he thinks everything I just told you is bullshit. And there is a kind of sense among people who do evolutionary psychology, neuropsychiatry, that, you know, we're on the cusp of, you know, finding all kinds of important stuff out. And maybe if we ever get off the cusp, we'll have good answers to puzzles like what is consciousness, what counts as a self, how is personal identity forged. But the idea that brain scans in themselves are going to provide answers anytime soon to these questions strikes me as naive. And you know, Steve Pinker is a wonderful polemicist, but he knows nothing about the intricacies or depths of the history of philosophy because he holds it in contempt. And it may be that some things will become obsolete, or, you know, we'll have different causal accounts of categories of understanding we currently use but don't have a good scientific explanation for. So when I was editing Daedalus for 8 years, I ran an awful lot of articles about this subject because I find it fascinating. But you know, in this context, I just take it with a bit of a grain of salt, and with an awareness of how many of those people have a real kind of intellectual hubris about what they're going to pull off. I think I would incline to a little more humility. And, you know, Steve Pinker often seemed like a guy who wanted big answers to big questions now, and he was impatient, you know, to acknowledge that, well, maybe we don't know actually yet. The questions are too complicated. Anyway.
Hi. Given your last statement, I won't go into questions about Sam Harris and free will, but instead I'll ask you, you said that Montaigne said, "I let myself go as I have come."
Yep.
And I'm sorry, but I don't quite understand that. Would you mind elucidating?
What he meant is that if he found something in himself that was not susceptible to change, or it made him feel so bad that if he tried to change it, he would just give up. And he would say, okay, that's who I am. I think all of us have clusters of habits or inclinations or impulses that we discover in practice when they come into collision with moral teachings, that some are easier to change and accommodate than others are. I think it's not probably coincidental that a number of the characters in my book are homosexuals, trying to deal with that. And, you know, probably Montaigne, even though he was married, that was one of the features, you know, of, do you say, this is who I am, or do you struggle against it and denounce it and try to purge yourself of it? That's a very, you know, big ticket item, but I think that's what he had in mind. I'm not in charge of,
Yes.
you know, these.
I come from Thailand, and so the Eastern philosophy, like in Buddhism, life normally is a mix of an enlightened moment and a profane moment. So, but Buddhism endorses that a well-examined life is worth living. And the Buddha also provide the process, like in meditation or inside meditation, so that you can examine your feeling, your emotion, your thought, your state of mind, and through that, you know, you know what you are at the moment through this set of feeling, thought, and so on. And because you're aware of it through meditation, then you just acknowledge it. And from that, you know that this is another way of life that's going on. And once you know that, you know, it's just a way of life, and you don't what? Hold on to it. And you become, you know, you can live above that earthly moment and become more enlightened. And so that's a process that you become more enlightened. And so Buddha said, you know, examine life worth living.
Well, I should confess, obviously, the book is that I've published was relentlessly Europocentric, and it's not because I wasn't interested in Eastern forms of life that are clearly analogous to Western modes of philosophy, and in some cases these Eastern forms have given rise to what looks an awful lot like philosophies of life that grow out of Confucianism or Buddhism or what have you. I'm just too ignorant and limited in I was already out of my depth writing about Socrates. I mean, this is like, you know, who do I think I am? I'm just a little pipsqueak American, and I'm going to write about Socrates. So, you know, Buddha, it would have, like, my circuits would have all blown, and I wouldn't be here. So thank you for your intervention.
For me, your talk, for me, goes astray, though very helpful, because I think the question, the way the question is asked, what is the self or about the self, already delimits the answer. So what happens to me is I think about the philosophy of science, philosophy of ideas, and we start out with Heraclitus, who's worried about the flux, and then in order to fix that flux, we have a theory of forms, we have a way of conceptualizing the flux. My feeling is that method is not the method of the question that's on the floor today. To me, the word self is the wrong umbrella. For me, the word self is a misnomer already.
So what's the word that you
word
want?
self.
What word do you want to use?
I can't use a word, it's reductionism. Here's what I want to use. The word I want to use is that this term self, the referent for self, is really my interaction. It's not here, it's my relational.
Okay.
And so for me, I become a different self depending on my connection and bonding with what I'm relating to or who I'm relating to, which is in constant flux. And I should not conceptualize it to rid that anxiety.
Well, Montaigne would have agreed with you, so I'm not sure, until you give me a better umbrella, I don't know where to turn to. You know, my friends who are neurologists, when I see them, I say, hello, Professor Brain, and they say, hello, Dr. Mind. You know, we joke about this. So I thought that's where you were going, but it's not. I mean, the original meaning of the Greek inscription, know thyself, was actually, in all probability, completely relational. It meant know your place in society and know your limits. That is to say that in archaic Greek society, the notion of an inner life was irrelevant. It had to do with what role you played and knowing your appropriate station and playing that role in a society. So to me, it's not a concept that is forever contaminated by some kind of depth interpretation. It's been used frequently in many other contexts, but you know, that's just me.
Professor,
Yes.
thank you for your talk. I'm going to offer one aphorism and then the names of 3 public philosophers who I think arguably conformed their philosophies to engagement in the issues of our day. And the aphorism is, we live suspended in a web of meaning we ourselves have woven. If that be true, we are meaning-creating creatures, and inevitably we examine ourselves. What are your reactions to the quote and to the 3 public figures?
What are the 3 public figures?
Hang on.
It seemed like it was a pop quiz, but I thought at least you were going to give me the...
Okay. Amartya Sen,
Yeah.
Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and Princeton University's Peter Singer.
Okay. Well, it's an interesting trio. I don't know what you know, Amartya Sen has played a really important role in forging a new approach to measuring development around the world through something called the capabilities approach that he worked on together with another philosopher, Martha Nussbaum. And he's a pretty good example of a contemporary philosopher who has tried to walk his talk and do it at the highest levels of public policy. So I have great regard for him. Peter Singer is probably most famous for his book Animal Liberation, and Peter is someone who I know slightly, and he also is a person of integrity. He's a vegan. You know, it would be very shocking if Peter Singer, you know, were eating, you know, barbecued ribs or something. So I can report, and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he's dead, so I have no, but what was your question? I mean, we're all in a web of meaning, et cetera, et cetera. I mean...
Are we inherently meaning-creating creatures, which mean that inherently we examine our lives?
Well, even assume that we were inherently, whatever the spider analogy was, that we're in this web of meaning, which is a view that, you know, I'm sympathetic to. I don't see how it follows from that we're all introspective or self-examining, because you know, Dick Morris is a meaning maker, and he's a scumbag. I don't know if he's introspective or not, and I don't particularly care now that you mention it. So I think you can create all kinds. I worked for Newsweek for a long time. I was around people who basically pre-masticated bits of information and spit them out to the American public, and most of them I don't think were interested very much in themselves. They were eager to get to the 2 martinis.
was reading your book this week because I wanted to learn more about this. And I was struck by the fact that of the 12 people that you wrote about, there were different answers. And it brought me back to when I was in college and had my first course in philosophy, and I loved it, and I thought I wanted to be a philosopher. And then I studied the history of philosophy, and everybody had a counter argument, and there was no single philosophy. You pointed that out also. And I am still a philosopher. I spend my life analyzing and examining my life, and I came to the conclusion, which I think you've come to, that we who examine our lives develop a philosophy for ourselves the same way your 12 people did. And that's where I am. I am actually every day philosophizing and deciding, who am I, what do I want to do, where am I going, and that's my life, and I thank you.
Does it make your espresso taste better?
It makes it my life.
Okay. I kind of like your gloss on my book, but I'm suspicious about it at the same time, because when I was done, I realized probably what I'd created was a book that it does sort of suggest that each of these philosophers had evolved a unique style of life that was of some importance to them in terms of how they lived their life. But that makes it sound so Protestant to me. So.
Okay, I have nothing to say. I have only a question.
How do you ask a question without saying it?
That's right. So in his time, to discuss philosophical questions, Socrates would go to a market. Where would he go today to discuss philosophy? And to a little bit clarify, where a lay person could go to, do you know any good philosophy discussion groups for lay people, like Socrates would look for?
There actually is a discussion group that I'm aware of that's run by Anthony Gottlieb, who writes on philosophy for The New Yorker occasionally. And I don't know how you get in touch with it, but I think there's more than one that's around town. Obviously, one of the places you study philosophy ever, what Plato did, which was widely imitated, is established a school. So here we are at the New School. We offer classes in this subject, and I suspect some of them are open to you if you were curious. Socrates didn't just go through the market. Often the dialogues are set in the salons of very rich people. So it is the case that episodically I get invited to these kind of closed-door events. It's very exciting. It's like I've always wondered what it would be like to get all the way up the food chain to Davos or something, because occasionally when they're taking a break from figuring out how they're going to leverage their fortunes to rule the world better, they do amuse themselves by inviting people like Amartya Sen to talk about social justice. I guess that's not quite what you had in mind. But I also think, that when I was growing up and going to college, it was just kind of, I sort of thought, gee, I'm in college, so now I need to start thinking about the meaning of my life, and I should have these deep existential conversations. So really, I don't think among the people who are my dearest friends I've ever stopped having those conversations, and they're informal and they don't require, a structured environment. But that just, I guess, depends on who you know and who you've befriended and what kind of connection you have to them.
I think, can everyone hear me? I think I get the last question. So far, our discussion has focused on examining one's life through thinking. And I'd like to open up the possibility that in the 21st century, people are examining their life through bodily or experiential means, through avatars, through other experiences. And I wonder what your thoughts might be about that avenue of an examined life.
Well, the people I write in my book are not only head cases. I mean, some of them actually, it was very important, a corporeal dimension to their practice. Diogenes the Cynic is legendary for having lived in a tub, masturbated in the marketplace. He didn't need an avatar, he just went for it. It's the old direct approach, you know. With mass media, it's true, you have other opportunities to express God knows what. And that's true, you know, anybody who's an ascetic or sees the body as not sharply demarcated in the kind of the prison of the soul, the experience is very, very important category to philosophers like Montaigne and Emerson. And what it means is thick. It's not, it's hard to analyze, actually, which is why they're not often read in philosophy departments. So I think there is a tradition which you could also find analogously in Eastern spiritual practices. But there's no doubt that what's going on today raises all kinds of strange issues. I mean, if you think about who are you and what is a self, if you have the capacity to generate multiple fake identities online and to explore online what it might feel like to live out that identity. And the other thing that's obviously different is that if you have impulses or desires, you know, when I was growing up, you didn't know how many people might share those peculiar tastes, and now you just Google it and you find out that there's virtually a club for every strange pursuit that you can imagine. So that changes what it would be to decide how you want to live your life, what the connective tissues would be in terms of interactions with people and so forth. So, you know, you're right that it changes the stakes. And of course, the funny thing about the internet is it's another form of disembodiment, and how that fits with, you know, the body itself is, I think we're about to discover as we hurtle into the future. Thank you.
Let that. Thank you for respecting centuries of philosophers and your guests here today. You've really been exceptional. Thank you.